We now move on to our reading. It comes from Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or maybe one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. May God add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of Scriptures.
Would you pray with me? Lord, take my lips and speak through them, and take our ears and open them so we may hear your word for us. And then take our hearts and our lives and fill them with your love. And then guide us so that we may be faithful servants who are grounded in both your word and your love. Amen. So today's passage is taking place when Jesus and his disciples are at a place called Caesarea Philippi. This is a town outside of Galilee. I have a map. I hope we can see this a little bit. And so Caesarea Philippi is kind of in the center, right where the green and the purple meet. And this bigger body of water at the bottom, that's the Sea of Galilee. And so Capernaum, which is Peter's hometown, and actually kind of Jesus' home base of ministry, is about 60 miles walking from Capernaum up to Caesarea Philippi. And these actually lines are the journey that Jesus takes as he's traveling around in the ministry. But as he's doing this, he's going around this region with his disciples, and he asks his disciples, because he's kind of curious about how the people are receiving him, and he says, "Who are the people saying that I am?" And the disciples tell Jesus the names, and he says, "Some of them have been calling you John the Baptist. Some are saying Elijah or Isaiah or Jeremiah, or some are saying that they're not naming a name, but now you're either an old prophet they don't know or a new prophet." But none of them have actually said the right thing. But then Jesus turns to his disciples and he asks, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And while the people had a bunch of answers, none of them were the right ones. They were maybe on the journey towards being right. He was wondering if his disciples actually know who he is. These are the people that are his closest friends who've been traveling with him through his ministry. They were the ones who ought to know, right? And Jesus is checking in with them because we know sometimes that they were slow on the uptake. They didn't quite always know exactly what was happening with Jesus. And it's Simon Peter steps up and answers, right? He's always the brash, impulsive, the first to act disciple, right? We've talked about this a few weeks ago. And he says, "Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Right? It's actually quite a declaration. It's quite a testimony about Jesus. And it's quite a moment for Jesus and his disciples, and especially for Jesus and for Peter. And it's a special time. And actually, after he makes this declaration about Jesus, first Jesus blesses him. Because he says this revelation it has come from the Father, and it's a blessing to be able to have said that about Jesus. And then he renames Simon. We know him as Peter, but he was actually Simon before, and he said, "Now you are going to be named Peter. And this is actually kind of a word play on the word rock. And he tells them that you are going to be the rock on which the church will be built on. Now, some interesting thing I have. So Peter, this first line is the Greek word for Peter. And then Petros, which is the Greek word that we see for Peter. And then Petra is the Greek word for rock. And so Peter and Petra and Petros kind of mean the same thing, and it's just different conjugations at the end. And so he renames him a rock and says that, again, even Hades, even death itself, the biggest enemy people have, death, will not stand against it. And then he gives Peter the keys to the kingdom, basically. And say, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be lost in heaven. It's quite a blessing that Jesus bestows upon Peter. And it's quite a story and a moment in the ministry of Jesus and his disciples. A few things I want to go on. I have a couple of what I call interesting nuggets I want to talk about first, before we go deeper into the text. Now, first off, the thing is, this is a very highly contested passage. This is a passage that has been argued about in the church for a long time, mainly because, or the big capital C church, so universal church, because there's a lot of arguments, because one of the things is that the Catholic Church has hung its hat on this passage when they talk about apostolic succession. And what that is that they believe Peter was the first pope, and Peter has passed down the pope the keys to the heaven. So things, the authority of having the keys to heaven and having everything that you bind on earth bound on or bound in heaven, everything loosed on earth is loosed in heaven, right? And so having that authority and that power, the Catholic Church has held on that every single pope since Peter has had that authority. Now, there's been a lot of arguments. There's even been church splits over whether Peter was the only one that had that power or not, right? And so some believe that Peter was the only one that really had that. And while the Pope is important for leadership in the church, they don't have the same keys to heaven that Peter did. You know, some also have, the church, there's churches that have left over the issues of even having the Pope, right? Or having somebody on earth have that power, right? And if you've ever kind of heard the story about, St. Peter or St. Pete being at the pearly gates of heaven, and he's the one with the book, right? That's where this kind of belief comes from, is that Peter is the one who has that power to say, well, who's in and who's out, right? And so this has been a very contested passage in the history of the church. Also, in this passage where Jesus is talking about how Peter is going to be the rock on which he builds his church, the word that they use here is ekklesia. Here it is on the screen in Greek. Ekklesia. And that is really means church. Do you know that there's only 2 places in the entire 4 Gospels that the word church appears? And this is one of those 2 times. And so while, of course, Jesus is very important to everything, not going to discredit that, but a lot of people give the credit to forming the early church to Peter and to the apostles in all of the actions that we see in the book of Acts, right? Some people don't really see how the church was formed or founded in the Gospels. They think it's in the book of Acts. However, this passage shows us that Jesus is already laying the groundwork or the blueprints for the church. The church is not a human idea that the apostles came up with. It's actually something that Jesus wanted us to build. And so those are some interesting things to think about. But now I want to go back for a moment to Peter's testimony. His answer to Jesus when he is asked, now who do you say that I am? And we see that Simon answers, he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And I've already mentioned how this is a contested passage and that people in the church have argued about Peter being the foundation of the church, but I want us to think about something. What if the foundation or the rock that Jesus was actually building upon was not Peter, the man, but actually Peter's testimony and what he had to say about Jesus? Let me explain that for a second, because I think it's important, because Peter is an imperfect person. Just like us. Peter wasn't perfect. Sometimes if you lay a foundation, if you set up a house on a foundation that isn't perfect, it's going to crumble and fall apart. Right? It's going to shift. It's going to crack. It's going to fall over. But you see, his testimony about Jesus was perfect. What he said about Jesus was perfect. But we know Peter messes up a lot. And that even Jesus does too. Because actually, this is the very next paragraph in Matthew, where after Peter makes this great declaration, he is blessed by Jesus, he's given the keys to the kingdom, he's renamed by Jesus. In the very next passage, we see this. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day raised. Jesus might have been thinking in that moment, oh good, even Peter's getting it, right? This hard-headed, brash, impulsive disciple, he's actually realizing that I'm the Messiah. And this is actually the first time in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus goes to start foretelling about his death and resurrection. He's trying to let his disciples be prepared and tell them what is about to happen. And so after Peter makes his testimony about Jesus, he's like, okay, they're getting it. I can start telling them about the next step. Because as they've been going through the Galilee area in ministry, it's at this moment that Jesus starts turning towards Jerusalem and the cross. And after Peter gets praised, and Jesus tells him about this plan, here is what Peter does. He says, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, meaning Jesus, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But he turned to Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. For you are setting your mind on not divine things, but on human things. So Peter goes from the rock, the foundational rock that Jesus is going to build the church on, to a stumbling block in a couple of verses. Right? And so that's why I want you to think about not as Peter as the human being, because that's why this is a contested passage. Because how could Jesus build the church on a human that's faulty, that makes mistakes? But rather, what if Jesus is building it on our testimony, on about what we say about Jesus? Because as a person, Peter's not worthy. None of us are really worthy. It's through grace that we are even allowed to even be thought about receiving glory. And yet, Jesus still builds the church upon him. Maybe he was talking about, well, Peter, I'm going to rename you the Rock because you're so hard-headed. And yet, I'm about to build the church upon what you just said. Your testimony, your belief, and your faith in me being the Son of God. Because his testimony and his belief about Jesus was perfect. And so maybe this is the strong and solid foundation rock that the church is built upon. And my friends, when we think about how this then in turn turns to us, if Peter's testimony is that foundation stone, we are still the other stones that are still building up the church. You see, Peter and his testimony about Jesus is that foundation. The church started in that moment with him and with Jesus and the other disciples. And then it goes on. And actually later, when Peter writes his first letter, he is talking to the church, the people. And he says, like living stones. He calls us living stones. Let yourselves be built into spiritual houses, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You see, while Peter was that first stone, my friends, we are living stones. We are the stones that are coming together to still build up the church. And we're not talking about a brick and mortar building. The church is a people. And we're those living stones that Jesus and God still use to build the church today. But unfortunately, just like Peter, when he goes from that moment of being praised to being called Satan, we have those moments when we become a good living stone or a stumbling block, right? So I want to ask, what kind of stone do you think you're being? Are you a living stone? Or are you a stumbling block? What are we saying about Jesus in our words and deeds? And what are we making the church be because of that? How do people see that? How are people knowing what the church is and who Jesus is through what we are doing? I have a funny story about keys to a church. So back when I was in college, my mom was appointed to be the pastor at FEMC Van Alstyne, which is on the eastern edge of our district. We found an interesting thing that the church was for the community that we didn't really know, because we were the new pastor family in town. And while we were there, an issue came up with one of the main doors that went to the office. The lock mechanism was just old. It was 80 years old probably. And we just like, look, we need to replace the door and the lock. And we thought, while we're at it, let's just do all of them. They're all about the same age. We have some money. Let's just redo the locks to the church. And so we replaced it because everything was just worn out. All along, we thought this was a good thing because the locks needed to be changed, or just the mechanisms needed to be changed. And with that came a new key, right? And so it was also re-keyed too. And it wasn't long before we started getting phone calls and people coming up to the church wondering, asking, why doesn't my key work anymore? And we're like, well, who are you? You're not a member of the church. And they're like, oh, well, we just live like 2 doors, we're over there. And they're like, well, what do you need a key for? And we soon realized that almost the entire downtown kind of area had a key to the church. Because it was a place where people came and met. You know, even if they weren't members, it was like came and got coffee or came and it was a resource center. But more than that, the most important thing is in the entire town of Van Alstyne, it was the only place, unless you had a storm cellar of your own, because the church had a basement, and it was the only place you could get below ground in the entire town. And most of those old houses all around, you know, were pier and beam houses. People didn't have money to have safe rooms in them or to have storm cellars dug. And so, unbeknownst to us, lots of times there were 200 people in the basement of the church when a bad storm came through. It was a place of refuge. It was a safe harbor. It didn't matter whether you remember or not, they had all kinds of different people that had keys because the first person would come and unlock. And everybody else, it was just always the place people came if a bad storm was coming through. And while it's a funny story because we thought we wouldn't do much damage to the community by changing the lock, we realized what the people of that church made that church for their community. that church was seen as a safe place people could go. And what better testimony to what the church should be than that? That when the storms of life are raging, people can come and find shelter and refuge. But my question again is, who do we say Jesus is? What are we making Jesus' church into? Because what we say about Jesus matters, my friends. What we do matters too. And what we make the church or this particular community of faith matters. With our words and our deeds, are we saying that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, like Peter did? Or are we saying something different? Like, are we using Jesus' name just for our personal gain and for fundraising or whatever it is? And what are we making the church? Are we making the church the place Jesus wants it to be, or is it a social club where only members are allowed? Like I said earlier, just like Peter, we have times when we are good living stones, when we are doing what we should, when we are doing good work and giving a positive testimony about who Jesus is, and we're building the church into something that is good for everyone, where everybody is welcome. But just like Peter, there's also sometimes we fall short. When we mess up, when we become a stumbling block for somebody, or even ourselves, right? When we give Jesus a bad name, or when we turn people off from the church because of what we do or what we say. But my friends, I've been the pastor here for a little over 2 years now. And what I can say about this community of faith, this church, is that we have done a great job of making this place be a welcoming community. I've heard about it from people that have come and have experienced it. And people are welcomed in. But one of my mindsets is that we can always improve. You can always do better, right? Even if you did something really well, you can do it even better the next time. So I want to compliment you first, but remind you that we always have more opportunities to say who Jesus is through our words and our deeds, and to build up the church as living stones. And so we need to remember that what we do and say is important. Because what we do and what we say builds up the church, gives a testimony about Jesus. And these things are important. So my friends, as we prepare to go back out into the world, recharged and refreshed from this time in worship, and go to work in the mission field, we need to remember to keep that in mind. Always be asking yourself, who do I say Jesus is? Whatever action it is or whatever thing you're doing, say, what does this say about Jesus? And am I building up the church, or am I tearing it down? Because my friends, Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Son of the living God. And he built the church upon those words, that testimony of Jesus, or of Peter. And my friends, we are the people that are still building the church today and telling other people about Jesus. So who do you say Jesus is? Who do you say Jesus is? Keep that in mind. Who do you say Jesus is? Amen.